The sun had not yet risen over the shattered village, smoke curling from crumbling rooftops, and the air thick with dust and tension. Captain Elena Torres crouched behind the remnants of a stone wall, her rifle steady, her breath controlled yet shallow. The ground littered with debris and the silence almost deafening, as if the earth itself were holding its breath for what was about to happen. And she could feel the first stirrings of danger creeping through the ruins. Footsteps echoed faintly in the distant shadows flickering across the broken streets. She scanned carefully, her eyes narrowing at every movement, every slight motion signaling potential threat. The number of enemies rumored to be approaching 90, yet she alone remained. Hidden, her mind calculating angles, escape routes, every muscle coiled for action, and she sensed that the first strike could come at any moment. The suspense stretching taut like a drawn bow. Elena adjusted her grip on the rifle, the cool metal grounding. Her, the wind shifting, carrying the faint scent of smoke and fear from the village. The first flashes of movement appeared on the horizon, distant figures advancing cautiously, unaware of her presence yet deadly in number. She counted silently to herself, every step a potential trigger for chaos. The sun rising slowly, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and merge, and the tension building with every heartbeat threatening to explode into action. A sudden shout broke the quiet, the enemies, signaling to each other, the sound sharp and urgent. Elena froze, her senses heightened, every nerve on edge. She knew the first shot could start an avalanche of violence. The walls around her offered some protection, yet she realized that the advantage was fragile every moment, a test of patience and instinct, and the suspense coiling tightly around her, ready to snap with the first contact. She took a deep breath, her finger steady on the trigger. The first enemy appearing through the rubble, unaware of her sightline, she aimed carefully and fired, the shot echoing across the broken streets, the body collapsing silently and the others not yet noticing her presence. Her heart pounding, yet controlled, the rifle ready for the next movement. The sun climbing higher, revealing the battlefield, and the suspense growing as she knew the enemy would soon realize the threat and adjust. More figures appeared at the edges of her vision, moving quickly, trying to flank her position. Elena shifted silently, her training guiding her every action. She fired with precision, each shot finding its mark. The enemies faltering momentarily, their numbers vast, yet their coordination flawed. She felt the adrenaline surging through her veins, her mind calculating trajectories and timing every second. Now a question of survival, and the suspense tightening, because she knew the wave of attack would not relent. Explosions echoed in the distance, debris scattering across streets, the enemies advancing with renewed intensity. Elena ducked behind a broken wall, her rifle scanning the approach, the mud and dust clinging to her boots and uniform, the first of the enemy breaking cover only to fall under her careful aim. She moved fluidly between positions, using every shadow and ruin as protection, the numbers pressing forward and the suspense building as she understood that the hours ahead would be a test, unlike any before. She rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding a volley of fire, the enemies shouting. Coordination commands, their voices harsh and urgent, the streets a blur of motion and chaos. Elena keeping her cool, calculating her next move each second, precious, the rifle an extension of her will, the dust and smoke mixing with sunlight creating a surreal battlefield, and the suspense sharpening as she sensed the full scope of the siege pressing in around her. The enemy numbers pressed closer, the first wave breaking against her defenses, momentarily stunned by her unexpected skill. She moved from cover to cover, firing with calculated efficiency, each shot precise, the village around her, a maze of destruction, debris and smoke masking her movements, the wind carrying the scent of gunpowder and fear, and she realized the fight had only begun, the suspense twisting tighter as the enemy regrouped and surged again. Elena leapt across a fallen beam, landing silently among rubble. The enemies still unaware of her position in some cases, and already faltering in others, her fingers tightening, On the rifle, adjusting aim for the next target, every motion deliberate, controlled by instinct and training, the battlefield alive with tension and threat. The sun climbing higher, casting harsh light and shadows, and the suspense deepening as she knew that the hours ahead would demand every ounce of focus and endurance. A loud crash reverberated nearby. The enemies alerted, moving faster and more aggressively. Elena pivoted her position, the rifle tracking multiple targets simultaneously, each shot deliberate, each movement precise yet fluid, the mud and dust clinging to her face, uniforms and hair marking her passage through chaos, the numbers still overwhelming yet fragmented by her skill, and the suspense coiling as she realized that her endurance would be tested to the very limit. Hours passed with relentless waves, the enemies pressing again and again, Elena moving like a shadow among the ruins, firing, reloading, calculating, adjusting her position, every second vital. The village echoing with shouts, gunfire, and explosions, the air thick with heat, dust, and the metallic tang of battle. The sun now high overhead, casting long, stark shadows, and the suspense building unbearably. Because she knew she could not afford a single mistake, she ducked behind a wall, narrowly avoiding a grenade explosion, the debris and smoke filling the air. Her breath steady, her mind racing as she fired another sequence of precise shots, the enemy faltering yet pressing the numbers, daunting, the sun beating. Down the battlefield alive with chaos, her strength tested yet unwavering. The suspense snapping taut as she realized that her survival depended on absolute focus and the relentless endurance of her body and mind. The sun began to dip low, the enemy still pressing, but exhaustion creeping into their movements. Elena using every remaining shadow, every ruin, every angle to her advantage. She fired steadily, moving fluidly across the streets. Each shot calculated, the mud and debris marking her passage. Through the battlefield, the village echoing with the sounds of struggle and the suspense intensifying as she knew that the final wave was approaching and her endurance was nearly at its limit. A sudden figure moved too close, and she fired without hesitation. The enemy collapsing, the remaining attackers realizing the scale of their underestimation, faltering briefly, yet still pushing forward. Elena, pivoting her rifle, scanning for the next threat, every second, precious, every movement, vital. The sun, dipping, lower shadows stretching across the battlefield, and the suspense snapping taut as she prepared for the final confrontation of the relentless 8 hours. The sky darkened slightly, the last rays of sun casting an eerie glow across. The ruins, the enemies regrouping for what could be the final push. Elena adjusting her grip on the rifle, every muscle coiled, her mind racing through the remaining tactical options. Each breath measured, each heartbeat counting toward survival. The battlefield alive with anticipation, and the suspense tightening like a wire ready to snap at the moment of final contact. She moved from cover to cover, the numbers, still daunting, yet fragmented, her skill turning chaos into controlled precision. The mud and dust streaked across her face, uniform and boots, a badge of survival, the enemies faltering momentarily with every precise shot, the shadows lengthening across the village, the sun setting, the suspense coiling around her, ready to explode. Because she knew the final wave would decide whether she would survive the night. The evening air was thick with smoke and heat. Captain Elena Torres pressed herself against the shattered wall, the sounds of battle echoing through the ruined village, each distant shout, each metallic clang sharpening her senses, her rifle steady. In her hands, her eyes scanning the shadows for movement, the mud-streaked ground beneath her boots trembling slightly from distant explosions, and the suspense twisting tighter as she anticipated the next wave of attackers. She shifted slightly to a better angle. The enemies advancing cautiously but with relentless numbers, her finger steady on the trigger. Every movement precise, calculated, her heart pounding, yet controlled, the setting sun casting long, sharp shadows across the broken streets. The debris hiding threats and the suspense coiling as she realized that one misstep could unravel everything she had fought to survive. A sudden flash of movement caught her eye, a soldier attempting to flank her position. She pivoted instantly, firing. 2 shots that echoed across the village, the enemy faltering and scattering the air thick with gunpowder and smoke, the sound of footsteps clanging over rubble, the wind carrying the faint smell of blood and dust. The suspense heightening as she knew the enemies were learning from her strategy and adapting faster than expected. Elena rolled to a side street, narrowly avoiding a volley of fire, the walls around her crumbling slightly under the impact, the sun dipping lower, the shadows stretching longer. Her breathing steady her mind, calculating angles, escape routes, and firing positions simultaneously, each second crucial, each decision potentially life or death. The suspense snapping taut as she realized that her endurance would be tested, beyond anything she had ever imagined. She fired with precision each shot, reducing the advancing enemy by small increments, the 90 attackers still pressing forward, yet increasingly disorganized by her unexpected skill. She ducked behind a ruined wall, adjusting her stance, the mud clinging to her uniform streaked with sweat and dust. The explosions echoing faintly in the distance, the suspense building as she sensed that the longest stretch of the battle was yet to come, and that the next hour would push her to the limit. A grenade landed nearby, the explosion sending debris and dust across her face, Elena rolling instinctively, the blast barely missing her, the air vibrating with the force of chaos. She sprang to a new position, firing quickly at enemies advancing across open ground, the village streets littered with the evidence of destruction and survival, the sun casting deepening shadows, the suspense coiling tighter because she knew the enemy would regroup and attack with renewed ferocity. Hours dragged on, each wave of enemies relentless. Elena moving fluidly across the battlefield, firing, reloading, and adjusting her position, her body aching, yet her focus unwavering, the mud-streaked uniform sticking to her skin, her boots caked with debris, the air heavy with the smell of smoke and gunpowder, the suspense intensifying because she understood that the fight would continue until either she or every last enemy fell, and that her survival depended on absolute precision. She ducked behind a fallen beam, narrowly avoiding a sniper, the shot echoing overhead, and she pivoted, firing at enemies breaking cover, the village streets alive with chaos, the shadows shifting unpredictably, the sun setting, leaving only dim twilight, the mud and debris marking her path through the battlefield, her eyes scanning constantly, the suspense sharpening as she realized that exhaustion could be as deadly as the attackers themselves. Elena shifted to a rooftop vantage point, the height. Giving her a better line of fire, she fired at groups of enemies attempting to advance, the bullets tearing through the air, the enemy faltering yet still pressing forward. Each shot measured, each movement calculated, her body screaming for rest. But her mind focused entirely on survival, and the suspense stretching taut because she knew that the final hours of the siege would demand every ounce of endurance she had left. A sudden shout from below indicated the enemy was coordinating a fresh attack. She ducked behind a broken parapet, adjusting aim, firing 3 quick shots, the impact reverberating through the air, the mud-streaked and dusty uniform now soaked with sweat. Her heart pounding, yet controlled the village alive with the sounds of struggle, and the suspense coiling like a spring as she realized the final wave was approaching and her stamina would be tested beyond limit. She dropped to the street level, moving quickly across rubble, firing at enemies attempting to flank her, the shadows deepening as night approached, the air vibrating with the echo of gunfire, the mud and debris clinging to her boots and clothing, the adrenaline surging through her veins, each breath measured, each movement precise, the suspense tightening, because she knew that the culmination of this 8-hour ordeal was drawing near, and one mistake could be fatal. Hours stretched into darkness, the enemy still pressing but increasingly cautious, Elena using every shadow, every ruin to her advantage, her rifle moving like an extension of her will. The explosions echoing faintly in the distance, her body trembling from exhaustion, but her mind razor-sharp. The village alive with tension and fear, the suspense snapping taut as she anticipated the final confrontation of relentless adversaries testing every ounce of her endurance. She fired at multiple targets in rapid succession, the sounds of combat echoing across the empty streets, her movements fluid, despite fatigue, the mud-streaked uniform. Clinging heavily to her body each shot, calculated each breath, measured the enemy faltering, yet persistent. The air thick with smoke and anticipation. The suspense tightening unbearably as she understood that survival now depended on the last remaining reserves of skill and stamina. Suddenly, a figure moved too close, and she reacted instinctively, firing the enemy, collapsing the remaining attackers, regrouping, yet hesitant, their morale shaken by her precision and endurance. Elena, pivoting, scanning. Every angle, each motion, deliberate, the shadows stretching across the battlefield, the night settling in slowly, the suspense coiling as she realized that the end of the 8-hour ordeal was approaching and that the outcome would define the legend of her endurance. She moved from cover to cover, firing at the final waves, the village streets littered with debris and unconscious enemies, the mud and dust clinging to her skin. Uniform and boots, the rifle still steady in her hands. Each shot calculated. To maximum effect, the adrenaline surging even as exhaustion gripped her. The suspense snapping taut as she prepared for the last desperate attacks of the relentless enemy. The moon rose, casting dim light across the battlefield. Elena crouched behind. A ruined wall scanning the last group of attackers, their numbers dwindling but determination still present, the mud-streaked uniform torn and caked with grime, her body aching yet mind-focused, every nerve alive, the suspense twisting tighter because she knew that the final confrontation would determine whether she survived this 8-hour nightmare. Explosions in the distance echoed faintly, the remaining enemies faltering. She fired precise shots, reducing their numbers further. The village streets, now eerily quiet except for the occasional shout. The mud and sweat streaked across her uniform, a testament to survival. The rifle still steady in her hands, her breathing controlled, the suspense building unbearably, because the last moments of the battle would decide if she could stand victorious or fall exhausted on the bloodied ground. She pivoted quickly, adjusting aim at the final wave of attackers, the shots tearing through the night, the enemies faltering, their morale broken, the mud-streaked uniform clinging to her body, every breath measured, every movement precise, the village streets littered with the aftermath of relentless combat. The suspense snapping taut as she realized that the 8-hour siege was finally reaching its conclusion, and her survival now hung in the balance. Night had fully descended over the shattered village, the moon casting pale silver light across broken rooftops and twisted streets. Captain Elena Torres crouched behind the remains of a collapsed wall, her rifle steady her body, screaming from exhaustion, every muscle aching, yet her focus unbroken. The last waves of enemies still moving through the streets, their numbers dwindling, yet their intent deadly. The suspense taut around her like a living thing ready to snap. She pivoted to track a shadow, moving across the ruins, the figure hesitating as if sensing the precision of her aim. Elena firing a calculated shot, the enemy collapsing silently into the debris. The mud-streaked uniform clinging to her skin, soaked with sweat, blood, and grime. Each breath measured, her mind racing through angles and positions, the village alive with danger, and the suspense tightening as she realized the final confrontation was imminent. Another wave appeared at the far edge of the street, Elena rolling, behind cover adjusting her stance, her rifle moving instinctively. Her eyes scanning for any misstep, the enemies faltering momentarily under the precision of her fire, yet continuing to advance, her heart pounding but steady, each shot calculated. The shadows of the ruins deepening, the suspense coiling, as she knew the final hour of relentless combat was upon her. Explosions echoed faintly in the distance, the debris scattering lightly with each shockwave, Elena moving fluidly across the street, firing at enemies attempting to flank her, her boots caked with mud, Her uniform torn and stained, the rifle an extension of her body. Every movement precise, controlled, the village alive with tension, the suspense snapping taut as she realized that one final push could decide the outcome of 8 hours of relentless battle. She ducked behind a crumbling wall, narrowly avoiding a volley of fire, the bullets embedding in the rubble nearby. Elena pivoting, firing at a small group attempting to close. The distance, her breath steady despite fatigue. Her mind calculating each trajectory, the night air thick with smoke and gunpowder. The suspense tightening as she understood that the culmination of the siege was moments away. And her survival hung on razor-sharp focus. A grenade exploded nearby, the blast sending dirt and debris across her face. Elena rolling instinctively, firing as she moved, the enemies faltering yet still pressing forward, their numbers dwindling, yet determination unbroken. She pivoted to engage the next approaching group, the shadows twisting across the streets like specters, the suspense building unbearably as she realized that her skill, endurance, and instinct were being tested beyond anything she had ever known. Hours of unrelenting combat had brought her to the edge of exhaustion. Yet Elena pressed forward, firing from every angle, moving from cover to cover, the mud-streaked uniform clinging heavily to her body, her muscles trembling, but her mind unbroken, the last waves of enemies faltering as her precision and tenacity broke their morale, the village silent except for the echo of her rifle, the suspense tightening, because she knew the final strike could arrive at any moment. She leapt across a pile of rubble, landing silently behind a group attempting to flank her, firing quickly. 3 precise shots, the enemies collapsing into debris, the air vibrating with tension, the moonlight catching her rifle as she pivoted to cover another avenue. The mud and sweat streaked across her skin and uniform, every motion deliberate, controlled by instinct, the suspense coiling as the final wave approached and she prepared for the ultimate confrontation. The last group of attackers moved cautiously across the street, their eyes wary, their footsteps hesitant. Elena, tracking every movement, her finger on the trigger, the rifle an extension of her will, her breath measured, despite exhaustion, the village alive with the energy of the final clash, the suspense snapping taut as she realized that this confrontation would decide if she could emerge victorious after 8 hours of relentless battle. She fired at the approaching enemies, each shot precise, the impact echoing through the silent ruins, the remaining attackers faltering, the mud-streaked uniform torn and stained, the rifle steady in her hands, her body trembling from fatigue, yet her focus unbroken, the night air thick with smoke, the suspense tightening unbearably as she understood that survival now depended on the last reserves of endurance and skill she possessed. A shadow moved to her left. She pivoted instantly, firing, the enemy collapsing silently into the rubble, the last remnants of the attacking force hesitating, Elena pressing forward. Her movements fluid, her rifle finding every target with calculated precision, the streets littered with debris and unconscious enemies, the mud and sweat clinging to her skin and uniform, the suspense coiling as she realized that the siege was nearly over and the final moment of victory was at hand. The moonlight revealed the last 2 enemies attempting to regroup their movements, cautious, hesitant, Elena pivoting smoothly, firing, the first enemy collapsing, the second faltering under the precision of her aim. She pressed forward, using every ounce of strength remaining, moving from cover to cover, the village streets silent, except for distant echoes of battle, the suspense snapping taut as the outcome of the 8-hour ordeal hung in the balance. Moved to the final position, crouching behind a crumbling wall, the enemy hesitating, their morale shattered, the mud-streaked uniform caked with debris, sweat, and blood, her rifle steady, each breath measured, her eyes scanning every shadow. The village, streets littered with the aftermath of relentless combat, the suspense tightening unbearably because the final strike would decide the culmination of 8 hours of endurance, skill, and survival. Elena fired the final sequence of shots, each bullet precise, Each movement calculated, the last two enemies collapsing into debris, the village falling silent, except for her measured breathing. The mud and sweat streaked across her uniform, her body trembling, yet mind clear, the rifle still an extension. Of her will, the suspense breaking as she realized the siege was over, and she had survived every wave of the relentless attackers alone. She stood slowly surveying the streets, the ruins littered with evidence of the struggle, the moonlight casting long shadows over the battlefield, the mud-streaked uniform torn and caked with grime, her boots clinging to debris. Every breath heavy yet controlled, the rifle lowered slowly, the suspense dissipating into awe and relief as she realized that she had endured the impossible and emerged victorious after 8 hours of relentless combat. Her eyes scanned the village one last time, the silence broken only by distant shouts and faint movement, the adrenaline fading from her body, the mud-streaked and torn uniform a testament to endurance, her hands trembling slightly yet steady as she adjusted the rifle, the full scope of her achievement settling over her, the suspense resolving completely because the danger had passed and survival had been claimed through skill, courage, and unyielding determination. Finally, she stepped away from the ruins, the rifle resting lightly in her hands, her boots leaving deep impressions in the mud-streaked streets, the village silent under the moonlight. The 8-hour battle. Now complete, the mud and sweat a mark of survival, every movement a testament to strength and endurance, the suspense of the night replaced with the awe of victory, and the knowledge that she had faced 90 enemies alone and emerged undefeated.